Hey everybody. Recently in the comic book community on YouTube, there's been much disagreement about a very important topic, and that's rarity. I've heard folks say that no comic book is rare, all the way to every single comic book is rare. And so to help us explore this important concept, I brought in my friend Matt Nelson. When you hear that word rarity, what does it mean to you?
Well, I guess I look at it, both in terms of within the comic space, but then also compared to other collectibles. So I guess it's a subjective term, and it can mean different things to different people. But in comic books, typically most books, like the rarest books are obviously the Golden Age books, and you've had a higher attrition rate of those up until present day. And most comic books from the Golden Age, there's usually about, the earliest Golden Age books, maybe 50 to 100 that exist of each book, which is, pretty rare, especially considering that there were hundreds of thousands printed. And so the attrition rate's huge. And then, of course, once you get into the 50s, that number increases to several hundred. And then by the 60s on, you've got thousands and tens of thousands of copies that exist. But rarity, I think, to me, true rarity would be where you only have a few copies that exist. And that's really a phenomenon that you don't see much in or on many comics at all, because most published comics have a survival rate of at least 50 to 100. Obviously, you have examples like Motion Picture Funnies Weekly, where there's only 7 or 8, but that wasn't published or released. But then when you compare it to other collectibles, there are some fields like movie posters where you're lucky if there's 2 or 3 or 1 that exists of certain kinds of movie posters. But then you go to sports cards, and there, I think the survival rate of sports cards is considerably higher than comics, even for the older ones. And so really it's relative.
It was like, what are the factors that have occurred over time, over history, that have affected rarity?
Well, certainly during the Golden Age, the paper drives from World War II were a big factor. And I think in general, just the length of time that's passed is going to contribute to that attrition rate. And then also the collecting of comics, which really got going full force by the 60s and certainly the 70s. So those are all significant factors. But starting off with the Golden Age, 1933, when the books were beginning to be published, print runs were pretty quickly in the hundreds of thousands, and I think they even reached over 1 million in many cases. And so you could see that with the survival rate of Action 1 being around, by estimate, 100 copies. And you could, considering that book is submitted to us every single time it comes up the past 25 years, you can assume that we're on our way to slabbing all of them. And that would be the case more than, say, a random copy of the funnies or popular comics or something. So if you use that as a benchmark, I think we've graded 70 something. So we're probably on our way to about 100 copies. And I'm sure there are some random issues before that, maybe even after that, where the survival rate might be lower. It might be 75 copies or 50. But generally, I think it's probably like around that. It's pretty interesting how it's about the same across the board. And then the paper drives, of course, contributed to a lot of destruction of comic books during the 40s. And then by the 60s, when collecting started to take hold, the print runs were still about the same, or probably actually lower than they were during the Golden Age, but you had collectors saving those books. And of course, that continued up to the present day now, where the vast majority of a print run are saved by collectors. They're going straight to the hands of collectors and not being sold to the newsstand and casual readers who had a tendency to throw them away. So the attrition rate has shrunk considerably over the years. But the Golden Age is clearly that's where you're going to see the biggest, because the amount of time that's passed. And also, of course, the paper drives.
I'll dig into that a little bit too, because you're talking about Action 1 and that you think that the CGC census does a pretty good job of representing how many total books are out there. And I've also seen people look at the CGC census for almost any book and say that's almost a perfect representation of how many books that exist, how many copies. So my question is this: what is the relationship between the books on CGC census and what people want to know? And that is, how many books of an Action 1 or a Tech 27 or an ASM 129 actually exist overall?
Yeah, excellent. So there was Hulk 181 is a great example. So that's another book where at this stage, most copies are getting graded, even destroyed copies, even coverless copies at this point. It wasn't quite the case early on when CGC opened because values on that book were lower. But at this stage, we're seeing them. I mean, we're grading, dozens of copies a week. I believe we're almost up to 20,000 copies graded. So there was some, I think on Facebook recently, I saw a report or some data that was released by Marvel back in the 70s that showed the print run of an issue close to 181, and I believe it was like 300 or 400 or 500,000 or something. And so I started running numbers in my head. I'm like, well, if obviously a percentage of those were unsold and returned and destroyed, and then another percentage of those were thrown away, and then the ones that were left over have survived, and then what percentage of those have been sent into CGC to date? And I figured out it was about 50%. That was my guess. And so, that would lead me to believe that there's probably about 40 to 50,000 Hulk 181s in existence, and we're approaching about half of those in terms of grading, and that might be, it might be a bit of a stretch to apply that to all the vintage comic books and say we've graded half the AF-15s and half the Action ones, but we've graded like 2/3 of the Action ones. But again, that's going to be a book that was a heavy hitter out the gate when we opened, and we've graded every single one. I'm sure that's come to market since then. And so in that case, it's going to be a little bit higher at the 75% rate. So yeah, but then it's hard to, I think it's important to use those as benchmarks, because the other books, the other issues around those books, particularly, Silver Age and Bronze Age, are not going to be worth grading because the values are less. So it's not going to be worth people's time to send in like a very low grade copy of Hulk 183. And so I use those keys as benchmarks to determine what I think the scarcity or the commonality or how many existing copies are probably out there of that particular book.
So I want to make sure that I understand that. So for example, if you're looking at a Hulk 181 and you see the census count there, you could go back and say, well, Hulk 180 or Hulk 182 or Hulk 183, they probably have about as many books out there as Hulk 181, but they're not going to show up as much on the CGC census. And so your reference point should be that book that's the most popular. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because when they were published, I mean, no one at Marvel was sitting around going, oh God, we're bringing in Wolverine. This is going to be huge. This is going to be making movies about this in 40 years. This is, like, let's print 5 times as many. No, they were 181 was just like 180 and 182 and 183, 184. The print runs probably didn't change that much from issue to issue, and the attrition rate probably didn't change that much.
Yeah.
It wasn't. The kids were saving all those issues back then, and it wasn't until the 80s or 90s really when the 181s were getting pulled out. So yeah, I think it's a good benchmark to use. It's just the surrounding issues.
And I'm just thinking that probably works through the 70s, but as you get to the 80s and 90s and you're thinking about those first issues, those were way more mass produced than the following issues because of the speculation that they were going to be collector's items. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, certainly the number one issues, but and today now you've got tremendous hype, before books even published. So yeah, certainly as the market or the new comic market was moving more in the collector direction, meaning away from newsstands and into the comic stores, and the direct editions were becoming more prevalent, or a larger percentage of the print runs, then you probably had more of the publishers were more aware of the demand of a comic book before it came out. I mean, they're taking a popular character and giving him his own series, or having a crossover or something. They're playing up to that, certainly by that point to the fans. So you probably were going to see higher print runs on those issues. I'm sure that, and then there's some that they just totally didn't even think twice about, and it blew up later, and those are going to be average print runs. But yeah, certainly higher print runs on more anticipated stuff later on. I say, yeah, the comparison thing works best when you're talking about pre-1980 books. I would say that's probably when the scale started to tip in the other direction. Prior to that, it was pretty much all newsstand books, and the publishers were just spinning them off every month.
Now, this next question, I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent because I know somebody in the comment section is going to talk about this. And you answered this, Matt, when you talked to Swaggle Mickey a few weeks ago. This is concept of ghost copies. So the ghost copy is if, say, a Hulk 181 was originally a 9.0, somebody took it out of that holder, got it pressed, resubmitted, it came back a 9.4, but they didn't let you all know that that 9.0 was deslapped, right? And so there is a certification number associated with that 9.0 that doesn't represent a book anymore. So that's a ghost copy. And I've heard some people say that the CGC census is littered with these ghost copies. I mean, most of the copies that you see on census are actually not real, they're ghost. How would you reply to that kind of comment?
Yeah, I don't think there's that many ghost copies on the census. I think I think where they really affect the value or impact the perceived scarcity of a book, particularly in high grade, are going to be your older books in high grade, where the census numbers are very low. For instance, if you have like a Fantastic Four #1, where you get up into the 9s and there's only a handful of copies. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 ghost copies in there, then yeah, that could certainly impact the perception, particularly if it's like two copies and one's a ghost copy, 1 of 2 or 1 of 3 or something like that. But generally, I think once you get down into the lower grades or less expensive books or more common books, I should say, like Hulk 181, where you've got, or Spidey 300 is an even better example, where you've got plenty of 9.8s. You've even got a number of 9.9s on the census, and then 9.6 down. Of course, there's a bunch. I think there are going to be ghost copies in there inevitably, but I don't think there's going to be enough to affect the value of the book or the perception of its rarity in that grade. Because I just in my experience with resubmitting books, I think a lot of people have been responsible in returning the labels, even if it's not with the book. They'll do it after the fact. And this was certainly the case in the first several years of CGC, where the pool of people that were resubmitting books was very small, and the books were probably more rare, older, higher grade. And so there was a conscious effort. They were aware of that because it only hurted them to not turn the labels in, especially if they got an upgrade. They want that other copy off the census, because it's just going to affect the value of their book when they go to sell it. Now, I know today you've got a lot more collectors who are cracking books out and having them signed or having them pressed and regraded or whatever. And so, in those cases, you probably have a higher degree or a higher possibility of ghost copies. But I have a feeling that that's mostly happening with newer books and books that are more common in high grade. And so ultimately, even if there is a higher percentage of ghost copies, it's probably going to have little or no effect on the perception of value or rarity on the high end.
On a recent video that I did, somebody commented and they said, I have never returned a label to CGC after cracking. And they said it's because I think if I give the CGC label to CGC, they'll know it was a lower grade before, and they'll look at my book differently. Is that a misconception, Matt?
Yeah, that's a misconception. Yeah. We want the labels back. We encourage it. I think on the other video, I even offered some kind of credit for sending those back in. So we're not going to take the labels and start digging around and investigating. And when we grade the books, we grade them as they are in front of us, and we understand that books get pressed and books get upgraded. That's clearly part of the business, and so there's nothing that holding a label back and turning it later has absolutely no impact on that or our perception of the collector or anything like that. It's pretty commonplace. So I certainly encourage people to send in, and don't worry, we're not going to judge you.
If somebody turns in the old label with a book when they're trying to get it regraded, is that sort of separated out from the book before the graders see it?
No, we leave the tag with the book. And yeah, we do that. And there's many reasons for that. There's like 6 series, an extreme example would be books that were already 6 series that are coming back to the grading room. We've got to confirm that the prior signatures were witnessed under the 6 series program, in addition to the new ones that were added. Sometimes people they put them in, and we leave them in, and it helps with giving us some kind of visibility on the history of the book. Again, we still grade the book as it is in front of us. If there are times where the tag, it's an old grade, and we may differ from that grade up or down. And we've even had situations where people swap tags to try and influence us. But this is another reason why we grade the book in front of us, and not by we don't just go, oh, well, it was a 9.4, just give it a 9.4 again. Pedigrees, that's another one. Pedigrees come through, and we definitely, it helps to have that provenance carried forward. So yeah, a lot of reasons that they come through, but yeah, it's good because we're able to take it off the census immediately at that point. But if people don't want to turn the tags in, all I ask is that just pile them all up and put them in the mail to us every couple months, and we'll make sure to move them from the census.
Well, Matt, I wanted to thank you for being on my channel once again. Always a pleasure talking with you, and hope you come back real soon.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, Keston. It's been a pleasure, and we'll talk soon.